After 25 years in Unilever, doing so many different jobs, it sort of spans the entire company, whether it's to do with brands, categories, countries, the whole bit, really. So has really seen the company at every level and brought that massive experience to bear on the role of CSO, which has just been amazing, and she will be very much missed. Next to Gail is John Steele, CEO, I'm told, in a very big way. And we will hear from him a completely different take on how a small organization still can use leverage to bring about a level of change which otherwise mightn't happen. I'm going to come to John second, and sitting next to him is Santiago Gowland from Nike. I call him the boss of system innovation. I'm sure there's some grander title than that, but that's essentially what he does at Nike, and has been there 2 and a bit years now, maybe a bit more, helping Nike to get hold of some of these huge challenges of which their company is, even as big as Nike, is just still one quite small part. Okay, so I'm going to just get the discussion going with them, which is why I'm going to sit down, and then we will bring the discussion to you once we've kind of thrashed it around ourselves to begin with. Santi, I'm going to start with you at the other end, okay? There's a kind of story about big companies which says that big companies are incapable really of engendering any serious radical change at all because they're so protective of their core business model. And a lot of the theory about this says you've got to have the small companies, the disruptors coming in from outside, breaking up this kind of hegemony of complacency inside the big companies and finding new energy in the system that way. Now, I think you'd probably disagree with that, really.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Good, thank you. Good question. Now, the two things on that point. It is true, and one of the things that companies are trying to do is disrupt themselves by creating some incubators or, sort of innovation platforms, sometimes inside the company, sometimes in a hybrid fashion, right, so half and half, sometimes even outside the company, to really get some of the longer-term innovation and some of the disruptive innovation outside of the, operational grinder and the sort of the market timings of products, right? And the other thought is that depending on how companies define the scope of innovation, they can begin to tap more into the disruptive space versus their own agenda. And let me explain. So we look at innovation in 3 ways. There is a competitive innovation area, which is very much IP-driven. Typically at Nike, that will be related to product performance, so something that really can drive market separation through product positioning, right? And that's highly curated, and pretty much done in a controlled fashion inside the company. But there is another type of innovation which really deals with innovation issues that the company doesn't have either the capability or the capital to drive. And we call that collaborative innovation. So, for example, if you want to innovate the palette of materials and get better performance polyester, you can work with many other companies, unlock competitive advantage in your industry while working with other industries that use the same palette of materials to accelerate innovation and funds against that particular point. But the third level is even if you do great competitive innovation and also collaborative innovation, sometimes companies, as Jonathan was referring to in his introduction, face systemic issues that they can't change by themselves. And this is where companies need others to innovate for them, others to change the structure of a market or the incentives of a market in order to disrupt the current business model. So when you look at closed loop and all this conversation around circular economy that WEF and MacArthur Foundation and many others are driving, there are a lot of things that are even beyond the power of a company and their collaboration network. So how do you send the market signals for innovation to happen in that level? So, for example, how do you send the market signals for new data mechanisms and transparency mechanisms for the management of toxic chemicals, or new incentives to create the certification models for monitoring and management of chemistries. So there's things that really transcend even the value chain of a company and involve many other industries in those solutions. So on that, the trick is how do you send the market signals and how do you create the innovation partnerships that can catalyze resources against that type of innovation. The three of those can, I think, give a better chance to a company to shift their business model.
And if you right now had to place Nike on your spectrum from competitive to collaborative to systems changing, is it individual projects that you place on that continuum, or is it the company as a whole?
It's a really good question. It's a really good question. And the boundaries obviously are blurred, So, for example, materials are key for Nike because 60% of the environmental footprint of Nike products are attached to the materials that we choose. So, there are some materials that are really performance-driven, and those are kind of in the competitive space. There are some materials that are key to our palette, cotton, leather, and polyester, for example, that are really, really complex and require collaboration. And there are some of the materials that we want to also, replace some of the toxic, some of the chemistries from the palette. Remember that, talking about the place we are today and our industry, we are using the same palette of materials. We've been using the same palette for the last 80 years. It's really amazing, the lack of innovation there. And materials are the Trojan horse for sustainability. Yeah. Energy, waste, toxics, are all wired into the materials that you choose. So when you talk about toxics, we use this platform Launch, for example, is one example with NASA, USAID, and State Department to call for global innovation against that. And sometimes you will discover in a systems innovation platform things that are really competitive. And that's, a matter of how do you deal with those innovations as you vet them and as you kind of accelerate them. How can you then negotiate exclusivities or, whatever it takes.
Great, good. Hold those thoughts. John, CafeDirect, much-loved brand, small brand. Some would choose to talk about it as a niche brand. I never quite know whether people use the word niche lovingly or disparagingly, but it's interesting how they inflect that word. Can small brands, even much-loved ones, such as CafeDirect, can they actually really get this system changing?
Well, we have, and I think we must, and I think part of having large and small together is probably part of the answer, because I think, I've been at CafeDirect for 2 years, and I think when I was in big business, and I've worked in some of the biggest businesses in the world, big business could be disparaging about small business, especially when you look at it from turnover and financial measures rather than perhaps some of the other impacts we could have. And certainly small business sometimes feels the same way, and I think bringing them together is probably a way to help. And I always found it interesting to see large businesses setting up small incubators and small businesses feeling incredibly fragile and under-resourced. But if you look at the committed kind of businesses like CafeDirect and others across the world, that they have helped change the way business is done over more than 20 years in terms of direct trade and fair trade. And without those kind of pioneering efforts, that wouldn't have moved forward, and it starts to go a long, long way. I think also the influence we have is way beyond our turnover. So, I've been amazed at the way CafeDirect chooses to work. I mean, we have a charitable foundation we've set up, which is owned by the growers of the business who are shareholders of the business and who are directors of CafeDirect. And by doing that, you get real from the bottom up, you get real understanding. And so rather than providing, fish for people, you're helping them to actually do fishing. So the incredible power of engaging the community delivers an exponential return in terms of impact. And I think, I've seen growers who have then taken their own money and added it to money that we've provided, or other people like Comic Relief or Knight Foundation and so on have added. But then I think the other thing that the business has done is then use technology to try and bring that community together to make that a sort of everlasting sharing of resources. So the foundation's launching a technology platform called WeFarm, which enables kind of peer-to-peer learning across the world amongst the community. So I think because you haven't got the resources, you've got to think harder and you've got to get closer to people to make a difference. So
have you been have you been weakened or reinforced by the large companies? Let's just think for a moment about coffee and tea in particular. By the large companies developing a sort of halfway house thingy, you know, Rainforest Alliance certified or something like this. Has that actually made it easier for you to say this is what the principles and the practice of fair trade done properly means for CafeDirect? Or has it so subtly left you hanging over the edge a bit, you know, not quite in there with the big players?
I think it's difficult. I mean, and the bunch of committed 100%ers, as we call ourselves, often consider this point, because if you look at 20 years ago, you'd never have thought you could have got people like Cadbury engaged in this, or Nestle. And so that's fantastic to have inspired those people, but to have inspired those competitors has also knocked your financial and other bits of performance on that kind of side of the business. So I think it's incredibly exciting to be able to do that. I think it is now, how do you keep that moving, and how do you keep people moving along?
Is it explicitly part of your mission to get the big people to do what you've been doing?
It is to influence the communities across the globe, and we talk about bringing growers and drinkers together and trying to drive change through more direct relationships.
Yeah.
I think within that, though, to get scale, we have to influence larger organisations, more and more.
Okay, and they don't come much larger than Unilever. Now, we all know the Unilever story pretty well, Unilever's Sustainable Living Plan. One of the things that makes it distinctive is that the way it's characterised is that it is part of the growth mission of the company, doubling the size of the company, halving the footprint, the carbon, water and waste footprint. Those two things always go hand in hand. In fact, all Unilever spokespeople are drilled to make sure those two things always go hand in hand. With a few people, perhaps the 100%ers, they do question whether or not the pursuit of growth in that way is compatible with genuine system-changing radicalism. And there are some, even inside the company, who challenge whether it's possible to do that growth story and do real systems change. Gail, you've been thinking about that.
I have. I've been living it. So, first, sorry. So I've been sipping water all day. Firstly, I think it's important to talk about doubling the business, halving the environmental footprint, and significantly increasing positive social impact. Never forget that, because the one without the other makes no sense. But to your question, so can we halve the environmental impact through doing what we're doing currently? And it's very clear we can't. And why is that? Because innovation, we're driving as hard as we can. The business systems, we're trying to shift to make people understand that the financial drivers of sustainability are actually the financial drivers of how you shift a business to be sustainable long term. But more importantly, will make money now. Thirdly, I think the broader outreach to partners and customers is working incredibly well. The issue we have is that getting people to change is really hard. So at the end of the day, you can, if you give them a fantastic Nike shoe with a super green blah blah sole and they think it's really sexy and it can do something, but how much does it really do, right? But getting people in India who don't have much water, need to use less water, to use a product and change what they do on a day-to-day basis, it's really hard. And if you think about you and I, you know, when last have you been able to change something personally that you want to do differently? It's quite hard, you know, and we're kind of plugged into whatever it is, nudge, you know, we can read all the books, we can... The average person who wants to shift, it's really hard. So, where have I got to in this journey? I've got to the point where I say we must all do what we can, but at the end of the day, unless we get governments, partners, businesses to create a major system shift through all of the incentives and disincentives we can muster, it's going to be a far too long time before change happens.
Indeed, even if those opportunities that are there are seized hold of, and it's quite clear that that business case, which you referred to, is now taken advantage of by many, many more companies. It's clear, for instance, that as soon as you invest in some of the finance function, the surfacing of the numbers involved in this, the financial benefits becomes a very important part of the entire deal. One of the big things in the survey was that we still haven't done much of a job to persuade investors of the case to change. Not enough of a deal yet. It came through in the survey as one of the big issues. Can you just touch on that a bit, Gail, from a Unilever point of view?
Yes, so it's a lovely... Well, first, I just want to quickly recognize everyone in the room, if I could.
Everyone?
Everyone. Because the people who are here, who've given up their... What's it today? Tuesday night?
Monday.
Monday night?
Monday.
To come here. It's great because they're part of the change. So I think that's important. But just to go on to finance change. I was fascinated because I'm not a sustainability person. So I came from running businesses and I thought I was always just doing it. I didn't even know the word sustainability existed, to be very honest. And I was just trying to really run a business and make sure that we did the right thing. And then I moved from South Africa to the UK, and I discovered there's this profession called sustainability. And I thought, oh, that's very interesting. And then I got more into it and understood it's about really trying to transform the way businesses work. Having gone into that, I then tried to understand, well, as a business person, what really drives me? Well, first of all, meeting the needs of my customers and consumers, but also making money. And then thinking about, well, why is this huge schism there between, doing the right thing and making money? It just makes sense to me because they're obviously connected. So, what is Unilever trying to do in that space? Well, Paul interrupted the general movement and suspended quarterly earnings forecast. But more importantly, since then, we're trying to do a couple of things. So we launched the first fast-moving consumer goods green bond, which is really trying to help, I guess, the market to understand that unless people understand that there's money to be made out of doing the right thing, the world's not going to shift. And so we launched this bond, which is really we didn't need the money, but is going to finance 6 of our factories that are going to be largely sustainability driven, but also deliver business. And the bond was 300% oversubscribed and came in at a more than competitive rate. And that's what Unilever's trying to do, to try and show that sustainability is not separate, it's mainstream. And that's what all of us should be trying to do. Yeah?
Great. Okay. I'm just putting you on notice here. I'm going to come to the audience in a moment, but I'm going to ask you, just before I go to wider questioning, which example of brilliant system change is the one that gives you most hope? From outside your own organization, obviously, okay. So I'm just putting you on notice now because I know that's a really mean question, and I get quite cross with people who just pop that into the proceedings without any advance warning. So just be warned, that's what's going to happen. One of the things that came through in the survey was that we had to seize the moment now, with Paris bearing down upon us very quickly. Cristiano Figueres' blog is very clear that this is the time where business and government really are going to have to make that change process work. There is a lot of leadership now in the corporate world around more radical decarbonization, against efforts to move towards renewable energy, about things like the green bond and so on. Just very quickly, as pointers for 2015, this is not the question about who you admire most, as pointers for 2015, which of the consortiums you're working through looks as if it's going to make the biggest difference around climate change, running up to Paris in 2015? John, I don't know whether you join with kind of others in that kind of pursuit. Probably not.
I think we're more, our environmental focus is with our growers and with our social impact.
Yeah.
So, less so. So I was going to, okay, I'll leave it at that. I think.
Okay. No. Just on 2015 quickly before you come on to your own brilliant examples. Santi,
maybe two short comments. One is we set up BICEP, as you know, in the US, which is an organization that brings our industry together for...
Spell it out, Santi.
BICEP.
Yeah, no, spell it out. We all love acronyms here.
B-I...
But doesn't it stand for something?
Business,
innovation for climate,
energy,
something.
program, something.
God, you don't even know your own bloody acronyms. I mean, honestly, does anybody here know what BICEP stands for? Fantastic. Do you work for Nike? No, obviously not. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Good. So, and then the other thing is, one of the things that is clearly needed for 2015, as you know, is like to articulate the voice of business that would benefit from a lower carbon economy in order to decouple the growth from constrained resources, reduce operational risk, and so many other issues, right? And that is such a massive part of the world economy that really, really needs that market transformation to a lower carbon economy to articulate the voice a little bit better, more clearly, to just say, let's not discuss about the 10% we don't agree if the price of carbon should be this or that, or what are the kind of the right subsidies or incentives, but let's at least have a clear voice that says we support transition towards a low carbon economy, because that's fundamental to achieve our mission and growth.
There are loads of voices. The question is what's being done. And I'm really impressed with the mayoral programs in China. So instead of I'm sure China has its own policy initiatives. I do believe that the program they have in place to encourage significant change and environmental stewardship in their greater business environments which mayors run is groundbreaking. I want to take that to Africa because I think that's going to work very well. And I think if we could do it in many more places in the world where we really devolve responsibility of how you're going to shift the economy to people who are on the ground really trying to make a difference, and give them responsibility and make them accountable to creating shifts, that's going to help.
Okay. Now, by definition, you're all the good guys here. Paul Gilding, who writes from Australia, blogs about the speed of change and the need for more radical decoupling, has identified this as a moment in which the good guys are going to need to stand up and be explicit in their condemnation of the bad guys. And he thinks at the moment the good guys are just far too nice and mealy-mouthed about those earth-trashing, planet-cooking, fossil fuel monstrosities. Now, it's not likely, is it, that either Nike or Unilever are going to come out with a big broadside on the horrors of the fossil fuel companies. Even if you've read and understood Machiavelli, you're not going to do it, are you?
I think, that there is, and you made a little bit of a reference at the beginning. I would argue you need to be careful with, who are you in the system? What's your role in the system? And sometimes, companies get too enthusiastic and try to be the government of the system, or try to be the campaigning NGOs of the system, or the media of the system. You know what I mean by amplifying? And so I think that system change happens when each player in the system takes their own accountability and their own role in a very precise way.
Yeah. I think that's one of the most elegant get-outs I've heard for a very long time, but I have to admire it. It's great. Gail, you can just say, that's amazing, Sandy.
No, I'm not speaking for Unilever now. I'm speaking for both of us, really, me and Unilever. It's something that I've been challenged with ever since I really understood the fact that if you don't defossilize the broader energy grid, whatever we're trying to do is a problem, right? Because we can make small changes, but while we are still really drilling for oil, taking coal out the ground, digging up peat, it's a problem. So what do we do about it? It ain't so easy, really. Yeah? So, I've spent a lot of time looking at what Shell, BP, everyone else is doing. What about fracking? What about... I think we just need to all aim for the best. Because you can't switch the lights off, Can't switch the lights off. And there are many people in the world that need light. So how do we give them the right light? And there's some fantastic steps that are being built. So solar energy, obviously wind power has its bit, but the fundamentalism that we have between fossil fuel and nothing else, to be very honest, is quite stupid. Because, what's the alternative? So if we can understand how you can evolve from a current system that is hurting us all to one that can be regenerative for us all, that's good. Now, what does Unilever do about that? We sign climate communiques. We talk about limiting greenhouse gas emissions. We do whatever we can.
And you source 100% of your energy from renewable sources
in
America.
And in Europe.
And in Europe. So,
and in Europe. And have biomass.
Yeah. Sorry, I shouldn't have started that way, should I? It was a bad link there. Okay, so I think Paul Gilding's going to have to wait just a while before we get a clear set of companies that really want to point the finger of blame at the fossil fuel companies. Okay, we're going to come to the audience in just 30 seconds. I gave you warning. I want to know who your role model is for what you see as inspiring system change out there that you've spotted, you've loved, you've thought, whoa, God, I wish we could do something like that. What are your sort of hero system change initiatives? John?
Thank you for the warning.
Yeah, no, that's very fair.
I mean, I'm quite into the power of community and bringing people together because, you know, we've got 23 people and we enjoy bringing others together. A guy called Luke who looks after a business called Crowdcube, who I've done some work with, and who... Crowdcube, who has been one of, to me, the pioneers in crowdfunding. I think the way crowdfunding has enabled you to get closer to what you invest your money in and influence is an example. So I think that kind of market arena where you're breaking down barriers and breaking down some of the corporatization of it all is an example.
What's it changed? What's different because of this?
I think it has enabled businesses that wouldn't have got funding and support to have got it from people who really care about its long-term prospects. Things like that.
Okay.
Well, mine is probably a bit way out. It's Matubi from Kenya, who basically created a system where women planted trees to save the environment, created an enterprise out of it, lifted themselves out of poverty and, potentially got themselves some power in creating a vote. Yeah.
Okay. Santi?
I think I'm going to go a little bit more, traditional. I really like the case of the Marine Stewardship Council, to be honest. And even though you can criticize the time it took, and, this was one of the most complex problems, completely transcending national boundaries, very difficult to regulate from a government perspective. And I think that they, touched on all the pieces of a system, the supply element, and how do you fish, the rules of the game and certification, and also the market pool and branding and consumer awareness, So when you have those three levers, you can really begin to shift the system. And level of adoption is very successful. So, I mean, kudos to Unilever for starting that with WWF, but also persistence of, moving it through.
Thank you. Well, you might want to reflect on how you would answer that question were I to ask it of you, but I'm not going to, because you're going to be asking us the questions. I know I'm sort of pointing this way most of the time, but please don't despair. I have fantastic peripheral vision. So you're going to be okay over there. It's the cyclist peripheral vision. It's good. So we've covered a lot of ground here, obviously. I think it's probably forlorn to hope that there will be any corralling of all of your different thoughts into a particular line of inquiry, but if we can touch on